Hello and welcome to Devlog number 18. This devlog marks a pretty big milestone as Wednesday the 3rd was 1 year since my first Git commit of a reimagined vision for this project. A lot has been done in that last year, taking this from a ugly gray box prototype to a game that looks good and is fun to play. It's been a really exciting and crazy journey so far, and I'm really glad that so many of you have been there with us for this. Seeing our community steadily grow and seeing people talk about how excited they are for the game's release is really gratifying, and it's really great to see, and it's been a big motivator in some of the really hard parts of the last year of development. So before I get into the actual meat of the devlog, I want to announce, if you don't pay attention to our Discord, that we did open pre-alpha access to our Patreon supporters, so if you are interested in playing the game now as it exists, then you can become a supporter on there and get a key from us. I also want to say that earlier this week, I had a really cool opportunity to go on Space Game Junkies podcast and talk with them about the game's development history and the future plans and where we're going from here. So that was a lot of fun, and I want to thank them for having me on, and I'm going to put a link to that in the description so you guys can go check them out. Now, you may remember that it's been a couple extra weeks since the last devlog, longer than our normal schedule would dictate. And the reason for that is that the previous sprint was almost entirely focused on under-the-hood optimization and a couple quality of life features, so there really wasn't much to show off in a visual format. So I figured that since the 1 year anniversary devlog was coming up soon, I'd just roll all that into this one. On the optimization front, I took our 3 biggest bottlenecks and reworked a lot of their structure and code to improve them by up to 95 or 99% in some cases. As I talked about in a devlog long ago when I first introduced the dynamic armor system, I made it so that all of the damage effects you see on the hull are an actual direct mapping of the condition of the armor as far as game mechanics are concerned. But when I first implemented that, I didn't know how to do compute shaders and I was very afraid to learn, so I used a very hacky system of using a camera at minimum settings with a bunch of options turned off in order to render those brushes, the damage brushes, onto a texture and send that to the GPU. However, because I don't control the render pipeline, there's a lot of extra stuff that Unity does that I didn't have control over, and so every hit was causing up to 8 milliseconds of frame time to be wasted rendering those damage textures. And so what I did was I sat down and I took a couple days to learn how to do compute shaders, and so now all the armor damage is applied using a compute shader and retrieved using a compute shader, which reduces its frame time by 99% down to only 0.02 milliseconds. On the sensors front, I'd been using Unity's physics engine to do large sphere overlaps on all the signature colliders in order to figure out where contacts were, and I'm still using the physics engine to do cone overlaps for seekers, cone of views, and things like that, because the physics engine is really good at grouping things into spatial groups and it's more efficient that way. But for big spheres like the ship's sensor arrays, there's no reason to use a sphere overlap for that, so I've optimized that into using a sensor registry and then going through that full list of signatures and then tallying which signatures can be seen. So moderate performance improvement there, but it's going to become more important in the near future when I do a big sensor rework to greatly expand radar ranges and change the mechanics of how they work, but I'll talk about that in a future devlog. And then finally, another huge performance gain was in an optimization of how the visual processing system works. In some games where there were lots of missiles flying around, it was common for there to be lots of frame stutters as groups of missiles moved from one visibility cell to the next, because missiles provide vision in the area that they're in. And because of that, I did a pretty big optimization to that visibility cell system, and now those frame stutters are pretty much eliminated. On the quality of life front, I made major improvements to how the sphere widget works. It's now much less finicky than it used to be. It's still a little hard to use, but I've been non-stop iterating on it for the last year, and I don't think I'm going to be stopping anytime soon. We also finally added the ability to revert steps in command, so you can remove waypoints from the path that you've made or remove endpoints from missile shots in order to change mistakes or fix things without having to redo your entire order. And we also added audio feedback, which went a long way towards making the widgets feel like they're actually doing something. We also finally added chat as well as a positional callout system to signal to people on your team where they need to go or attack or defend, which were much needed features. And to round out the previous sprint, I made a lot of changes to how communications electronic attack works, but there's still going to be more changes to that in the near future, so I'm going to save that for a future devlog. Now let's talk about the obvious changes you've probably been noticing since the start of this video, because these are the things that were worked on in this sprint. The biggest and arguably the most important of these additions is game modes and objectives. The reigning issue in multiplayer for a long time has been the lack of objectives. There wasn't really anything on the map to drive players to a certain location or to create points of conflict, and so what would normally happen is that players would kite each other and sit off in the distance until someone finally decided to commit to an engagement. Combining that with the lack of map boundaries meant that battles could take a really long time while players kind of drove off into the abyss and didn't really use the map to its full advantage. To start us off, there are 3 game modes now. The first is Annihilation, which is your standard deathmatch that we had previously, destroy the enemy fleet. Station Capture, which spawns a work-in-progress station at the center of the map that one team is responsible for defending and the other team is responsible for capturing. That one needs a bit of work in that the station needs to become an actual functional object, hosting weapons and sensors and things like that for the player team that actually owns it, and then providing more of a threat to the attackers. And finally, Control, which is the game that you've been watching this whole time, where there are multiple control points on the map that players accumulate points for holding for a certain amount of time. The testers have reported they're having a lot of fun with this so far. They've been asking for these additions for a really long time, and I'm glad that they actually seem to have worked out. Eventually, I'd like objectives to be a little more than just hold this random point in space. Have them give you bonuses, like one of them has a sensor infrastructure there that gives you really long range, really accurate sensors to share with your fleet. Maybe an ammo depot or a derelict ship that you can capture, but those are all just ideas that are on the drawing board, and we'll see what we can do in the future. Adding new game modes is actually pretty easy. The way that I did the game mode implementation is that I extended the graph structure system that I used for scripting the missions for the tutorials so that there's a series of setup conditions and then a series of game end conditions and update conditions, and it works out pretty well, and hopefully it'll mean that people are able to create their own mission scenarios for multiplayer in the future. The remaining issue is that since the deathmatch game mode still exists, and there's no objectives there to force players into conflict, there needs to be a way to prevent players from just riding off into the sunset and kiting each other indefinitely. In the tactical view, you'll notice a new red ring off in the distance that's not centered on any ship. That's the new map boundary, and any ship that crosses that line for more than 60 seconds will be removed from the battle. Think of it as a withdrawal from battle, and eventually in the conquest mode, when a player passes a ship over that line, it essentially is telling the ship, I want you to retreat and warp away. So that serves a double purpose of, one, keeping the game tight and in the map boundaries where players can actually engage each other and have fun doing that, because being kited is not fun, and two, providing a way in the future for players to withdraw ships that are damaged but not destroyed and use them later. Some small updates include a rework to beams so that they now have a damage fall off and their range is slightly extended, and they also have an effect of traversing the distance between the ship and the target instead of just instantly appearing there. We added a 4th and 5th voice set to round out that. I also added a call signs feature because I got really tired of seeing people name ships Railgun 1, Railgun 2. I want the ships to have actual, the kind of name that a ship would have, rather than just a utilitarian name, and so now call signs allow players to not only give their ship a nice name, but also give it a name like Railgun 1 that's purely utilitarian. And finally did a graphic design rework on the action menu so that it fits with the rest of the UI, and also added a quality of life feature to it where when you're using the positional and target select widgets, it shows you when something is too far or too close, but you can only see those warnings if you're using the pointer select widget, and when you're targeting something by right-clicking the track, you can't see that. So now the weapons in the list will show you a warning if it's too far, if it's too close, if the targeting mode is unsupported, and so it just makes it a little clearer when a weapon will and will not be useful. And now the biggest news is the addition of a new class of ship, which is the light cruiser. This is a class of ship we've needed in the game for a really long time because there's just such a big power discrepancy between the smaller ships and the heavy cruiser, and the light cruiser fits nicely in that gap between. While the heavy cruiser's job is to be a fleet mainstay or shoot at the eventual battleship that will be added, the light cruiser's job is to support shooting small platforms from large platforms, so it's got a bunch of size 2+ mounts that mount our new intermediate range 250mm guns, while also having 2 size 3 mounts like the heavy cruiser does. The players really seem to like this one, and I'm glad we finally got it in. It took us a while because I had drawn a concept for a light cruiser a long time ago, but when I went to model it, I really didn't like it. And so Stefmos started sitting down and coming up with a bunch of different variations for what the hull could possibly look like in 3D instead of in my sketch, and then we kind of narrowed it into what we wanted it to look like, and now it's got a nice sleek design. It looks like a fast ship that's meant to chase down smaller ships, and we're really happy with it. So that wraps up our first year of development. As I said, it's been a lot of fun and a crazy ride, and I want to thank everyone who's stuck with us and expressed interest in the game for your support. If I get time, I thought about putting together a kind of retrospective video showing clips from all the previous devlogs, showing where we came from and where we are now, but that's assuming that I find some time to do it. In the next couple weeks, I'm going to turn my attention back to sensors and start doing a little rework to expand sensor ranges and change the fall-off mechanics so that engagements can take place at a much longer distance and sensor tracks don't just poof out of existence once you cross a magic threshold. And hopefully we'd like to get the battleship in before the end of this sprint. That will round out our full set of ship classes for this particular faction. And then once that's done and that faction is finished, we can hopefully reallocate art asset development time to either another faction so that not everyone's fighting with the same ships, or just creating a new set of weapons for this faction. And that concludes this update. Thank you for watching.